So today we will be talking about climate activism on the front line, but I did also want to put a special lens on gender justice, or, oops, this is not the first slide, or the role of women in climate justice specifically, especially women from the Global South and from environmental defenders. But before that, I wanted to introduce myself really quickly. So I am Mitzi. I am a climate justice activist from the Philippines. And I think for you guys to understand where I come from, I need to tell you how I started my activism, how I got to where I am now. I grew up seeing the impacts of the climate crisis. The Philippines is one of the most vulnerable countries in the world to the climate crisis. In the past 20 years, we've had the highest number of extreme weather events. I think the latest German risk index report puts us up as the most at-risk country to climate change impacts. And yet, despite experiencing all that and seeing communities being consumed by floods in my own country, I didn't know that that was climate change, because the way education was taught to us was very westernized and technical and foreign and not empowering at all. It wasn't until much later on and I was able to talk to a Lumad indigenous leader, and he didn't even tell me their name because it's dangerous to be an activist here in the Philippines. So there were security issues on that. But he was telling us about how they were being harassed and displaced and militarized and killed, all for protecting the planet and their ancestral homes, their forests. And very simply, he shrugged and chuckled and said, "That's why we have no choice but to fight back." It was so simple to him. He wasn't even trying to convince me of anything. And that's what I'm here for you to, that's what I'm here to do today with you guys. I don't want you to be convinced to join or be convinced to be intersectional or to be a climate justice. Climate justice activist. I want you guys to see the same way that I saw that it is something that is as simple as fact, that we have to fight back because the climate crisis is already here. Very quickly, I don't think it's needed, but I like to do it in case there is someone in the audience who does need a refresher. The climate crisis is here, and that's something that we really need to remember, that it's not a problem of the future. It's not coming, it is already here. Billions of people across the globe are already being impacted. And the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or IPCC, which is basically the UN body of scientists, has urged that carbon emissions need to be cut in half by 2030 to give us a reasonable chance at keeping global temperature increase to manageable levels, which is 1.5 degrees Celsius from pre-industrial times. Right now, we are plus 1.2 degrees Celsius global average warming. So this is already the destruction and the impacts that our countries and communities, especially in the Global South, in developing countries and exploited countries, are experiencing at 1.2 degrees. So every fraction of a degree that we can keep it lower is better for everyone. And that's really what climate justice is, ensuring that we are building a world where people feel safe. And I want you guys to write in the chat what you think climate justice is and what it means to you, because that is how we also understand a little bit more how to achieve climate justice, because climate justice isn't just one definition. It's several definitions coming together as a collective. When we are able to achieve the climate justice definition that each individual has, then that is what climate justice is for a community. But what I like to have people imagine is that, yeah, I can tell you all the things about climate reparations and how these are the things that are important to make sure that we have climate justice and a just transition, taking out the fossil fuel industry, et cetera, et cetera. But also it's really about ensuring that we understand the world that we're fighting for. That is how we get closer to climate justice. It's being able to imagine and grasp and really feel in our mind's imagination, in our mind's eye, what climate justice looks like. And to be able to understand that more, I'm inviting everyone to remember their happiest moment, the moment when they felt at peace and joyful and safe. For parents, maybe it's the first time you laid eyes on your children. That's how my mom describes climate justice. For students, maybe it's a time when you got a really good test, or you were having a lot of time with your friends, or it was finally the first day of summer break. For me, it's when I'm singing and dancing with my friends during protests, especially at global summits, because we're chanting in different languages and we don't know what we're saying, but we know that we're fighting for the same thing. That is what climate justice feels like, to ensure that everyone feels safe and truly joyful in every single moment of their life, that no one feels anxious about whether or not they have a roof over their head the next day, whether or not they have food on their table the next day, whether or not there's a storm coming, a drought coming, a fire coming. Being able to feel safe for everyone, that is what climate justice is. And to have a more formal definition, climate justice also considers the fact that the countries responsible for climate change are usually the ones least affected by it. So we've seen how the US, for example, is historically responsible for the climate crisis. And this doesn't mean the individuals in the US, but really it's the multinational companies, the fossil fuel industries, and the global North political leaders that refuse to act and prioritize people and planet over profit. It's also understanding that climate justice has an intersectional nature. We've been saying this since earlier, and how issues, especially like class, but also gender and race and disability, can make the impacts of climate change worse and can be made worse by climate change. A very concrete example of this is how in 2013 with Typhoon Haiyan or Typhoon Yolanda, it hit a region in the Philippines that doesn't usually get hit by super typhoons. And there were floods that devastated the communities. But even months after the typhoon was gone, because of the economic devastation that the community experienced, young girls and women were forced into prostitution because there was no other alternative for work. And that is how you see that the climate crisis exacerbates gender injustice. Other impacts of the climate crisis on oppressed genders, and I would like to recognize that a lot of the data and the statistics I'll be saying here are very binary. So it's women and men, but not because there's no oppression on other genders. It's because there's no research or data into it, because it's not something that our world and society thinks is worth putting research and data into. So that is yet another thing to look at, because then you're not able to adapt, you're not able to take these into account because there's no research in it in the first place. But a recent report shows that women in many places are the main producers of the world's staple crops, particularly in developing countries and regions likely to be adversely affected by climate change impacts. However, only a small minority of women farmers have access to land tenure or own their own land, and this is causing a lot of problems. In the Philippines, for example, majority of small farmers don't own their own land. And I always need to take a step back to kind of just explain how farming might look like, because I know that it looks very different in the different countries. But in the Philippines, imagine medieval Europe, where there is a landlord that doesn't even touch the land, doesn't help at all. He owns all the land, large, vast amounts of land, and you farmers, small farmers, have to till by hand, farm by hand, no animals, no machines. Animals, you have it if you're privileged and if you have money to have it, but most people don't. And then you have to either pay rent to the landlord or you have to give a part of your produce to your landlord. And mostly it's women who are doing a lot of these work as well. And agriculture has a big impact on the climate crisis, but also the climate crisis is making agriculture more difficult, the agricultural industry more difficult. And as you have the agricultural industry more difficult, more men are having to work in going to the cities to find jobs and leave the agricultural sector behind, which means our food security is also threatened. And so it kind of just starts to cascade, all because we didn't give back the land to the farmers. Another impact that women and experience with climate is that 80% of people displaced by climate calamities are women. There's also an increase in gender-based violence following climate-induced disasters. There's also how when life gets harder, it's usually young girls that are pulled out of school first to help out at home. So when does life get harder? When there's a typhoon, when there's a drought, when there's food insecurity, when the climate crisis exacerbates existing socioeconomic issues. It is young girls that get pulled out of school. And what does that mean? That we don't have young girls empowered to one day take space and take part in creating solutions for climate change. to follow to quote Anne Main of the Pan-African Climate Justice Alliance, in climate change-induced disasters, it is primarily the poor who have suffered the most, the majority of which are women. And this is the result of women's marginalized status and dependence on local natural resources, which in turn increases their domestic burdens. And so women must be at the heart of climate justice, because the role of women in climate justice is women are change makers, agents of change. And I quote the UNFCCC a lot, which is the United Nations Framework on Climate Change Convention here, on why climate action needs to include women, because I also see the hypocrisy of the very institution that I'm quoting. They say that 100% of the population needs to be involved. They say that empowering women means more effective climate solutions. They say that women are vital to building climate resilience in communities, yet the way that we talk about gender justice in climate negotiations, for example, with COP27 coming up, is it's one agenda point in the entire sessions. It's one box that has this one department has to make sure that all the other departments talk about gender justice somehow, instead of every single topic having an aspect of gender justice in it. We can't just have gender justice as one box that needs to be ticked. We need to understand that when we're dealing with social injustices, it has to be a holistic approach. We have to make sure that we talk about climate change in a holistic approach. Otherwise, you end up with, let's say, climate finance, not considering gender justice at all, right? Because the gender justice issue was put in its own agenda, in its own topic. So we have to make sure that women and other oppressed genders are present at every single agenda, making sure that we're leading the way in climate justice. And this is, I also want to put a bit of emphasis on this slide where women are vital to building climate resilience in communities, something that a lot of global South or developing countries, Fridays for Future groups are doing is talking to the global North or mostly the European Fridays for Future groups to remind them how important this community building is for climate resilience. Because here in the Philippines, I know for sure that if there's something that's happening to me in my house, I can go to my neighbor, even though we've never talked to each other, even though I don't know them. I can go to my neighbor and they will help me. If there's a disaster happening in your country, who will you call? If there's that disaster happening in your home, if you're being impacted, if you have heat strokes because of heat waves, who do you call? Are you able to rely on the people closest to you physically? That is how important building a community is. And women are usually the ones leading this. Women are usually the first responders in community responses. And it's almost funny how going into challenges that women face for fighting for climate justice, that I've gotten a lot of reactions and responses telling me that I am, I'm too emotional. I'm doing it too much because I love, or I'm doing it out of care and I'm looking at it in an emotional lens where I love too much or I care too much and I'm nurturing too much and not looking at the economic side of things. But my question is, why are those two separate things? I care about the climate crisis. I talk about the economic side of things, the feasibility of things, because I care. And these characteristics of nurture and love and caring and community building, the interpersonal relationships that we have with one another, these are characteristics of our mother, both our mother, our parent, and Mother Nature. And stepping away from that thought is what brought us to this world that we live in the first place, where we think that Mother Nature is a natural resource to use, that we are not part of the ecosystem, that man is separate from the planet. When we are codependent, we have no choice but to protect Mother Nature because she protects us and provides for us. And that's something that we need to realize. A Global Witness report, which is a an NGO watchdog that looks at environmental defenders and land defenders, said that women who act and speak out also face gender-specific forms of violence, including sexual violence. And women often face a twin challenge: the public struggle to protect their land, but also the less visible struggle to defend their right to speak within their communities and families. And this is a direct quote from a lieutenant general of the Philippine Army. And I will read this slowly because it is difficult to understand. The rebel army now uses sexually clad recruiters, i.e. young girls in short shorts, in enticing young people, particularly young men, to take up such innocent-sounding issues as protection of the environment that serves as the hook to unsuspecting young people to team-building activities that are at the brink of the trap for integration into the rebel army. If you did not understand that, that's completely fine, because I don't understand it. I don't know the mental gymnastics that this leader, this military leader in our country had to take to get to this conclusion, where young girls in short shorts were reduced into objects of attraction for young men. And our calls for protecting the environment were reduced to techniques and tactics to recruit people to become terrorists, because this is how the Philippine government views young girls in the climate movement. The Philippines has been the most dangerous country in Asia for the past 10 years for environmental defenders and activists, and for the past 10 years, the third most dangerous globally. Our government is calling us terrorists, all because we're protecting the planet, because we're threatening the systems at play, because we're threatening capital, because we're threatening their profit. And I'd like to quote someone also, again, from the Indigenous Lumad group, that if you remembered my story in the very beginning, this one conversation that I had with one of the Indigenous leaders really changed the way I viewed everything. And there's this quote by Bibiyaon Ligkayan Bigkay. And when she was asked by Global Witness about her challenges as a woman leader, she said, "Then say, why should you be a leader when you're a woman?" But then she says, "But that kind of thinking is unacceptable. A woman must learn to stand and fight for what is right." She's the only woman chieftain in the history of the indigenous Talaingod Manobo people in the Philippines. And this is an 80, 90-year-old woman, really old, but she will go up against the mining companies with her tribe, with her tradition. It looks like an axe. So like, imagine an axe. And she will stare down these people who are trying to cut down her forest, and they will fold and they will turn back, and they know that they have no chance against this strong woman leader. And the beautiful thing that we're seeing now is that the climate justice movement is full of young women leaders. But it's also important to note that we can't just have women on board. When talking about women and climate justice, we talk a lot about girls' education, but boys' education is also really crucial and important, to make sure that we have boys who are educated to respect women and see them as their equals, and to see Mother Nature as something to be respected and not to be used. And so truly what we need is collective action, because we need everyone. Because if we want system change and not climate change, we need to see climate justice as social justice. And I'd like to leave you guys with this, that the fight for climate justice includes gender justice. It includes the fight for women's liberation, and the fight for women's liberation will only be complete when all people are free. Thank you.